Hey everybody, it's Retro DM Ray. I am back on the channel with you again for another look at the Best of Dragon Volume 2 and more of these old articles by Gary himself. This one is from February of 1979, issue number 22, and it is entitled What the Game Is and Where It's Going. This article is pretty important. I'll take kind of a commentary look at it here when I get all done with it. So let's just sit back and listen to what Gary has to say about what the game is and where it's going. Remember, this is 1979. The Dungeons & Dragons game pioneered role-playing in the gaming hobby. It brought fantasy before hobbyists, and it set before them a game form most had never heard of. Perhaps 150,000 persons now play the game, but it was by no means an instant success. The first 1,000 box sets, assembled and labeled by hand, took 11 months to sell, and Tactical Studies Rules was thrilled. Finally, a third printing of 2,000 sold in 5 months. So from January of 1974 to December of 1975, only 4,000 sets of the original version of the game were in circulation. Of course, I have no way of knowing how many pirated copies were in existence. Some estimates place the figure at about 20% of the total sales, some as high as 50%. In any case, 5,000 or 6,000 sets was certainly nothing to set the gaming world on fire, or was it? Today, the basic set sells 4,000 copies per month, and the sales graph is upwards. A month has not gone by in the last 2 years when I haven't been interviewed by one or more newspaper writers or independent journalists who want to know all about the D&D game and the concepts behind it. I've likewise been interviewed by radio and TV news media, generally for the same reason. At the risk of claiming too much for the game, I have lately taken to likening the whole to Aristotle's Poetics, carrying the analogy to even more ridiculous heights by stating that each dungeon master uses the rules to become a playwright, hopefully one of Shakespearean stature, scripting only plot outlines, however, and the players become the thespians. Before incredulity slackens so as to allow the interviewer to become hostile, I hasten to add that the analogy applies only to the basic parts of the whole pastime, not the actual merits of the game, its DMs, or its players. If you consider the game, the analogy is actually quite apt. The Dungeons & Dragons game is like none other in that it requires the game master to create part or all of a fantasy world. Players must then become persona in this place and interact with the other populace. This is, of course, a tall order for all concerned, rules, DM, and players alike. Relating a basic adventure, an episodic game session in the campaign, to a trip in an underground labyrinth does help the uninitiated interviewers to understand the simplest D&D fundamentals. Discover an unknown area, move around in it by means of descriptive narration from the dungeon master, overcome whatever obstacles are there, traps, problems, monsters, and return with whatever has been gained during the course of the whole. The DM takes the part of everything in this fantasy world which is not operated by a player. While this should not mean it is then a game of DM versus players, it does mean that it is a cooperative game where players must interact successfully amongst themselves first, and non-hostile portions of the campaign milieu thereafter, in order to be successful. The dungeon master is incidentally against the players when he or she is operating that part of the world, quote-unquote, which is hostile or potentially so, but in general, the referee must be disinterested. At about this point, I'm always asked, well, then, how do you win? Who wins? The answer is everybody, providing the game is well run. The DM gets the satisfaction of testing his abilities against those of the players, the fun of taking the non-player parts, and the accolades of participants when a particularly well-done adventure or series has been completed. Players enjoy the challenges of each situation and have the prospect of continuing adventures and puzzles to confront them, each with his or her own game persona. Thus, all who take part in the campaign get something besides a monetary diversion. Winning no more applies to D&D game than it does to real life. The successful DMs and players gain renown via their campaigns or their superior characters. To enthusiasts of the game, this is far more satisfying than triumphing in a single game or a whole series of games. Simply stated, the D&D game is a multiplayer game of fantasy role-playing where the rules give systems of resolution for common game occurrences, lists and explanations of things which are not actual, monsters, spells, magic items, etc., systems for interaction, and suggestions as to how to put this into the campaign, i.e., create the milieu. Once again, the campaign continues until the DM and or all the players decide it should end. As with any exercise in fantasy, it requires suspension of disbelief. Those who find the game interesting will soon enough thereafter create their own sort of involvement and belief. But why is such a game, and similar fantasy role-playing games for that matter, so popular? What is its appeal? Our modern world has few, if any, frontiers. We can no longer escape to the frontier of the West, explore darkest Africa, or sail to the South Seas. Even Alaska and the Amazon jungles will soon be lost as a wild frontier area. Furthermore, adventures are not generally possible anymore. The frontiers are receding into memories, modern communications make all the world available to casual travelers, and the most backward places are becoming more and more civilized. Certainly, it is still possible to go scuba diving, mountain climbing, auto racing, skydiving, and so on. These are expensive and risky endeavors for no real purpose in most cases. One can also have adventures as a criminal, or possibly as an agent of the government, if one is sufficiently qualified, but the former is distasteful to say the least, and the latter is most unlikely. Americans with more leisure time today than ever crave entertainment. Some desire adventure and excitement. Obviously, various entertainment media are doing big business. TV, motion pictures, spectator sports, recreational vehicles, sporting goods, book publishers, and game manufacturers are all growing. Quote-unquote escape fiction sells better today than ever, and witness the success of the recent science fiction and fantasy films. Looking toward outer space and the future for new frontiers and adventure is logical. The universe has fascinated mankind since recorded history, and today it seems quite probable that within a few decades, numbers of us will live off the Earth, and in a century or so will travel to the stars. Perhaps there will be frontiers and adventures enough then for all who care to test their mettle. But it is no less surprising for us to look into the realms of fantasy for imagined adventure. Most literate people grew up on a diet of fairy tales, Walt Disney, and comic book superheroes. We somehow relate to stories of young princes going out into the world to seek their fortune, of knights rescuing maidens in distress and slaying dragons, of dealing with wicked magicians and evil witches. The myth of all peoples contain great stocks of such fantasy lore. If nothing else, the desire to believe in such seems to be innate,